What if I told you that a single letter from an Amish boy could bridge two completely different worlds and change an entire community forever? When 10-year-old Jacob Fisher secretly wrote to Morgan Freeman after hearing his voice on a forbidden radio, he never imagined the Hollywood legend would actually show up at his one-room schoolhouse in Lancaster County. But what happened next shocked everyone, especially Bishop Yoder, who had spent decades protecting their community from outside influences. As Freeman's distinctive voice filled the classroom that autumn morning, no one could have predicted how his simple stories would spark a revolution of whispers that would test the very foundations of tradition. Was this the moment that would tear the community apart, or the miracle they never knew they needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happens when a simple letter bridges two vastly different worlds? In the heart of Pennsylvania's Amish country, where horse-drawn buggies still clip-clop down dusty roads and modern technology remains at arm's length, an unexpected connection forms between a celebrated Hollywood actor and a young boy with dreams bigger than his small community can contain. Morgan Freeman sits in his Manhattan office, surrounded by scripts and industry accolades, when his assistant brings him an unusual piece of mail. The envelope, crafted from plain brown paper and written in careful childlike penmanship, stands out among the glossy professional correspondence. Inside, he finds a letter from 10-year-old Jacob Fisher, an Amish boy who discovered Freeman's voice through a borrowed radio hidden beneath his pillow. Jacob's words, simple yet profound, speak of his love for storytelling and his struggle to understand why such tales are considered dangerous by his community's leaders. He writes about secretly practicing different voices behind the family barn, inspired by Freeman's distinctive narration. The boy's passion resonates deeply with Freeman, reminding him of his own childhood dreams and the mentors who encouraged him along the way. The letter finds its way into Freeman's thoughts during meetings and rehearsals. He recalls his own journey, the obstacles he faced, and the importance of having someone believe in your dreams. After careful consideration, Freeman makes an unprecedented decision. He will visit the Amish schoolhouse where Jacob studies. News of Freeman's intended visit creates ripples through the small Amish community. Anna Zook, Jacob's teacher, receives word with mixed emotions. While she recognizes the unique opportunity this could present for her students, particularly Jacob, she must navigate the delicate balance between educational enrichment and the community's traditional values. Bishop Yoder learns of the planned visit through concerned parents. The prospect of a Hollywood actor influencing their children strikes at the heart of his fears about worldly interference. He calls a meeting with David Fisher, Jacob's father, to discuss the potential disruption to their way of life. David finds himself torn between his son's obvious joy and his duty to the community's traditions. Jacob, unaware of the adult's concerns, fills pages of his notebook with questions he hopes to ask Freeman. His excitement spills over during lessons, leading Anna to pull him aside for a gentle reminder about the importance of maintaining focus on his regular studies. Yet she cannot help but smile at his enthusiasm, remembering her own childhood curiosity about the world beyond their community's boundaries. The preparation for Freeman's visit becomes a catalyst for deeper conversations within the community. Some families worry about exposure to outside influences, while others secretly hope their children might benefit from hearing different perspectives on storytelling and creativity. The schoolhouse becomes the center of an unspoken debate about tradition versus growth. Freeman, meanwhile, consults with cultural experts about Amish customs and appropriate behavior. He wants to honor their ways while sharing his perspective on the power of storytelling. His team arranges for a simple visit, without cameras or entourage, understanding the need for discretion and respect. As the day of the visit approaches, Anna finds herself mediating between various concerned parties. She assures Bishop Yoder that the children's lessons will remain focused on traditional subjects while carefully preparing her students for their special guest. She helps Jacob understand that his enthusiasm must be tempered with respect for community elders. David Fisher watches his son's growing excitement with a mixture of concern and wonder. He remembers his own childhood dreams, long since buried under the weight of tradition and responsibility. Through Jacob's eyes, he begins to see the possibility that storytelling might not threaten their way of life, but rather enhance their ability to pass down their values to future generations. The morning of Freeman's scheduled visit arrives with an unusual buzz of activity around the schoolhouse. Children arrive early, their clothes especially neat, their faces shining with anticipation. Even those families who expressed concern cannot help but be affected by the air of possibility that surrounds this unprecedented event. What will happen when these two worlds finally meet? Can the simple power of storytelling bridge the gap between tradition and innovation? As Morgan Freeman's car approaches the schoolhouse, these questions hang in the air, waiting to be answered in ways that might surprise everyone involved. The clip-clop of horse hooves against packed earth announced Morgan Freeman's arrival at the one-room Amish schoolhouse. His presence, unexpected and unprecedented, created ripples of excitement among the students who peered through the windows, their small faces pressed against the glass. How could anyone have predicted that a simple letter from a 10-year-old boy would bring one of Hollywood's most distinguished actors to their remote community? Anna Zook stood at her desk, her heart racing beneath her plain dress as she watched the black car approach. She had been teaching at this schoolhouse for 15 years, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this moment. The letter Jacob Fisher had written, the one she had helped him mail in secret, had actually reached its intended recipient. Now she wondered if she had done the right thing by encouraging Jacob's passion for storytelling. The children whispered among themselves as Freeman stepped out of the car, his casual attire a stark contrast to their traditional clothing. Jacob Fisher sat perfectly still at his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his slate pencil. Would the man who had inspired him through his movies and documentaries live up to his expectations? More importantly, would this visit bring trouble from Bishop Yoder? Freeman's footsteps echoed on the wooden steps leading to the schoolhouse door. Anna smoothed her apron and took a deep breath, knowing that this moment could either open new doors for her students or create irreparable rifts in their tight-knit community. The door creaked open, and Freeman's warm presence filled the room, his gentle smile putting everyone at ease despite their initial apprehension. "Good morning," he said, his distinctive voice carrying to every corner of the room. The children sat transfixed, many of them having never heard such a voice before, rich with authority yet tender with understanding. Anna noticed how Jacob's eyes lit up, recognition flooding his young face. This was the voice that had narrated so many of the stories he had secretly discovered through his hidden radio. The tension in the room began to dissolve as Freeman moved through the aisles, greeting each student with genuine interest. His natural ability to connect with children transcended the cultural barriers that separated their worlds. Anna watched as even the most shy students responded to his questions about their studies and daily lives. How could someone from such a different world make them feel so at ease? Jacob remained rooted to his seat, overwhelmed by the reality of Freeman's presence. The actor paused at his desk, recognition flickering in his eyes as he recalled the earnest words from the letter that had brought him here. "You must be Jacob," he said softly, and the boy nodded, unable to speak. The other students turned to look at their classmate, some with newfound curiosity, others with a hint of envy. Anna stepped forward, her role as teacher giving her the authority to guide this unusual situation. She had always believed in the power of stories to teach and inspire, even if such beliefs sometimes put her at odds with the stricter members of their community. Would Bishop Yoder understand that this visit could enrich their children's lives without threatening their way of life? Freeman's attention turned to the books on Anna's desk, simple readers approved by the church elders. His eyes met hers with understanding. They both knew that stories could be found everywhere, not just in forbidden modern entertainment. Kiwaya. Challenge would be helping others see this truth without disrupting the delicate balance of their traditional life. The morning continued with Freeman sharing appropriate stories from his own childhood, carefully chosen to respect Amish values, while still capturing the children's imagination. Anna noticed how he wove lessons about respect, hard work, and community into his tales, values that aligned perfectly with their own teachings. Could this be the bridge they needed to show Bishop Yoder that storytelling could strengthen rather than weaken their faith? As the morning progressed, more parents began gathering outside the schoolhouse, drawn by news of the unusual visitor. Among them stood David Fisher, Jacob's father, his expression unreadable as he watched through the window. The success of this visit would depend not just on Freeman's ability to connect with the children, but on his capacity to demonstrate to the adults that his presence posed no threat to their way of life. Anna caught glimpses of David's face as Freeman continued his interactions with the students. Would this father's love for his son overcome his fear of change? The answer to that question would likely determine not just Jacob's future, but the possibility of bridging two very different worlds through the timeless power of storytelling. Morgan Freeman's rich baritone filled the one-room schoolhouse as he wove tales of distant lands and timeless truths. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he moved among the students, his presence commanding yet gentle. Young Jacob Fisher sat transfixed, his blue eyes wide with wonder, drinking in every word of the stories that had previously existed, only in his imagination and secret letters. What made these simple tales so powerful? Perhaps it was the way Freeman brought each character to life, or how he found universal truths in the simplest of narratives. The other children, initially hesitant, now leaned forward on their rough-hewn benches, momentarily forgetting the strict rules that typically governed their daily lives. Anna Zook observed from her desk, her heart torn between joy at seeing her students so engaged and anxiety about potential consequences. She watched Jacob especially, noting how he mouthed the words along with Freeman, already memorizing the cadence and rhythm of professional storytelling. Would this moment of creative freedom come at too high a price? Freeman shared a story about a young boy who discovered his voice through helping others, carefully chosen to respect Amish values while nurturing the children's imagination. Jacob's hand shot up repeatedly, asking questions that demonstrated an innate understanding of narrative structure. How did the storyteller know what would happen next? Why did the character make that choice? Each question revealed the depth of Jacob's natural talent. Other students began to participate, their traditional reserve melting away as Freeman encouraged their contributions. Even the most timid found courage in this temporary sanctuary of storytelling. The morning sun streamed through the schoolhouse windows, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with each tale's turning point. David Fisher, who had been passing by the schoolhouse, paused outside upon hearing his son's animated voice. Through the window he witnessed Jacob's transformation from a quiet, often troubled boy into an engaged, confident participant. How could he reconcile this beautiful moment with the bishop's warnings about the dangers of worldly influences? The spell was broken by approaching hoofbeats. Bishop Eli Yoder's buggy pulled up outside, its wheels crunching on the gravel path. The children's expressions shifted from enchantment to apprehension as the bishop's commanding presence filled the doorway. Would this be the end of their brief glimpse into the power of storytelling? Freeman continued his tale, but now chose his words with even greater care, weaving in messages about respect for tradition and the importance of community. The bishop stood silently, his stern countenance revealing nothing as he observed this unusual scene in his typically orderly community. Anna Zook rose from her desk, struggling to maintain her composure as she faced both her spiritual leader and her desire to protect this precious moment of learning. The tension in the room grew thick enough to touch, yet Freeman's voice remained steady, drawing everyone into the story's conclusion. Jacob watched the interplay between the adults with growing concern. His father's words from that morning echoed in his mind. Some gifts come with too high a price. Was this one of those moments? The boy's hands clutched his slate tighter, where he had been secretly recording fragments of Freeman's tales. The morning's lesson teetered on the edge of two worlds, the familiar comfort of tradition and the irresistible pull of storytelling's ancient power. Freeman understood that these next few moments would determine not just Jacob's future, but potentially the role of storytelling within this entire community. As the current tale drew to a close, Freeman met Bishop Yoder's unwavering gaze. The calm challenge was clear. How could these two men, representatives of such different worlds, find common ground? The answer lay somewhere between the written word and spoken tradition, between the old ways and the new, between silence and story. The children held their collective breath, sensing the weight of this moment. What would happen when Freeman's modern storytelling methods confronted generations of Amish tradition? The answer would shape not only Jacob's future, but the very fabric of their community's relationship with the power of words. As Morgan Freeman's rich voice filled the one-room schoolhouse with tales of distant lands and moral truths, Bishop Yoder's measured footsteps echoed on the wooden porch outside. The children, including young Jacob Fisher, sat transfixed by Freeman's storytelling, unaware of the approaching confrontation that would test the delicate balance between tradition and progress. Bishop Yoder entered silently, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone except Freeman, who purposefully finished his story about a humble shepherd who discovered that true wealth lay not in gold, but in the stories passed down through generations. The irony of the tale's message wasn't lost on Anna Zook, who watched the scene unfold, with growing concern for her student Jacob. Mr. Freeman, Bishop Yoder's voice carried the weight of generations of Amish tradition. I wonder if thee realizes the disruption thy presence causes in our community. The bishop's words, though softly spoken, cut through the reverent silence that had followed Freeman's story. The children shifted uncomfortably in their wooden seats, while Jacob's father, David Fisher, who had arrived with the bishop, stood uncertainly by the door. Freeman turned to face Bishop Yoder with the same gentle dignity that characterized his storytelling. Bishop Yoder, perhaps we share more common ground than you might think. These stories I share, they're not so different from the parables that have guided your community for generations. The tension in the room grew as Bishop Yoder moved closer to Freeman, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Our ways have preserved our faith and our community for centuries. What purpose do these worldly tales serve except to plant seeds of discontent? Jacob watched the exchange with growing anxiety, his hand unconsciously gripping the notebook where he'd been recording Freeman's stories. Anna Zook noticed this subtle movement and positioned herself closer to her student, offering silent support while maintaining proper respect for the bishop's authority. Stories are vessels of truth, Bishop Yoder, Freeman responded, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in his narratives. They help us understand ourselves and our place in God's world. Young Jacob here, he gestured toward the boy, causing both David Fisher and the bishop to turn their attention to him. He doesn't just listen to stories. He finds the wisdom in them. David Fisher stepped forward then, torn between his role as a faithful member of the community and his love for his son. Bishop Yoder, my Jacob has always been different. Perhaps there's a purpose in that difference that we don't yet understand. The bishop's expression remained stern, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps of a deeper truth. Different is not always better, David. Our ways protect us from the world's influences. He turned back to Freeman. Does thee not see how thy presence here challenges the very foundations of our faith? Freeman considered this question carefully, aware that his response could either bridge the divide or widen it irreparably. Bishop, I've traveled far and met people of many faiths. What I've learned is that truth can wear different clothes but still speak to the same heart. The stories I share don't replace your teachings, they illuminate them. Anna Zook, who had remained silent until now, spoke with careful respect. Bishop Yoder, I've observed something remarkable in my students since Mr. Freeman began sharing these stories. They ask deeper questions about our faith, about our ways. They seek to understand rather than simply accept. The bishop's attention shifted to Anna, his most experienced teacher whose judgment he had trusted for years. And does this questioning not concern thee, Anna? Does it not threaten to unravel the fabric of our community? Before Anna could respond, Jacob stood up, his voice trembling but determined. Bishop Yoder, the stories help me understand why we live the way we do. They're like windows that let me see our world better. His words, simple yet profound, caused a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. David Fisher moved closer to his son, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about his own internal struggle between tradition and understanding. The bishop observed this interaction carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than condemning. Freeman watched the scene unfold, recognizing that this moment would determine not just his continued presence in the community, but more importantly, young Jacob's future. How could he help Bishop Yoder see that storytelling wasn't a threat to their way of life, but rather a tool for strengthening it? And more crucially, how could he ensure that Jacob's gift for understanding and sharing stories wouldn't be stifled by fear of change? The answers to these questions would emerge not through confrontation, but through the very thing that had brought them all together, the power of a well-told story. As Freeman prepared to respond to the bishop's concerns, he knew that his next words needed to do more than defend his presence. They needed to build a bridge between two worlds that only appeared to be in conflict. As the confrontation between Morgan Freeman and Bishop Yoder simmered down, David Fisher's wagon approached the schoolhouse, its wooden wheels crunching against the gravel path. The father's weathered face bore the weight of generations of tradition, yet his eyes held a glimmer of uncertainty that spoke volumes about his inner turmoil. What would become of a young Amish boy whose heart yearned for stories in a world that valued silence and simplicity? This question haunted David as he watched Jacob spend countless hours scribbling in his notebook, filling pages with tales that seemed to pour from his very soul. The community whispered, and David felt their judgment weighing heavily upon his shoulders. Morgan Freeman recognized the familiar look of parental concern in David's eyes. He had seen it countless times throughout his career, in faces of parents whose children dared to dream differently. The actor stood quietly, allowing David to gather his thoughts as Anna Zook observed from the schoolhouse doorway, her hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Freeman," David began, his voice carrying the strength of conviction tempered by fatherly love, "my son speaks of nothing but your stories." The words hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor praise, but rather a father's plea for understanding. Bishop Yoder remained present, his stern presence a reminder of the community's expectations. Jacob's recent behaviors had stirred something deep within David's memory, echoes of his own childhood desires that he had buried beneath years of tradition and duty. How many times had he himself gazed at passing travelers wondering about their tales? But the path of their people was clear, and deviation invited discord. Anna Zook stepped forward, her quiet authority as Jacob's teacher adding another layer to the complex dynamic. She had witnessed Jacob's transformation firsthand, how his writing had improved, how his mind had expanded beyond the conventional boundaries of their education. But was this growth worth the potential cost to their way of life? Morgan Freeman understood the delicate balance required in this moment. His response would need to bridge two worlds, one of artistic expression and one of preserved tradition. How could he help David see that storytelling wasn't a threat to their values, but rather a way to strengthen them? The conversation shifted as David shared his deeper fears. It wasn't just about the stories, it was about Jacob's future place in the community. Would his son's growing passion for storytelling lead him away from their faith? Would it create a rift between Jacob and his heritage that could never be mended? Bishop Yoder's presence served as a constant reminder of the community's structure, yet even he seemed moved by David's genuine concern for his son's spiritual well-being. The elder's rigid stance softened slightly as he observed the father's struggle, perhaps recognizing that this situation required wisdom rather than merely authority. Freeman drew upon his years of experience, not just as an actor but as a keeper, of stories that connected people across seemingly insurmountable divides. He shared with David how tales had preserved traditions throughout history, how they had strengthened communities rather than weakened them. Could Jacob's gift for storytelling actually serve to protect and celebrate their way of life? Anna Zook, witnessing this exchange, saw an opportunity to bridge the gap. She spoke of Jacob's recent writings, stories that captured the beauty of their simple life, tales that honored the wisdom of their elders and the strength of their community. These weren't flights of fancy drawing him away from their values. They were love letters to their way of life. David listened intently, his expression shifting between hope and hesitation. The wagon creaked as he adjusted his position, much like his mind worked to adjust to these new possibilities. What if Jacob's gift wasn't a threat but a blessing? What if his son's stories could help preserve their traditions for future generations? As the discussion continued, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard, much like the shadows of doubt that had begun to recede from David's mind. The question remained, could there be a way to nurture Jacob's gift while maintaining their sacred traditions? And more importantly, what would happen if they didn't try? Anna Zook stood at her classroom window, watching the last rays of sunlight paint Lancaster County's rolling hills in amber hues. Her students' arithmetic assignments lay untouched on her desk, her mind preoccupied with Jacob Fisher's situation. How many times had she witnessed bright young minds dimmed by the weight of tradition? Yet Jacob's case stirred something deeper. Within her, a long-buried memory of her own creative struggles. 20 years earlier, Anna had been much like Jacob, filled with questions that stretched beyond the boundaries of their ordered world. She had written poetry in secret, hiding her verses between the pages of her Bible, letting her imagination soar while appearing to study scripture. Those poems had been her refuge, her private rebellion against the constraints that sometimes felt too tight around her spirit. Morgan Freeman's presence in their community had awakened these dormant feelings. When he spoke to the children about storytelling, Anna had recognized the same light in Jacob's eyes that she once saw in her own reflection. But unlike Jacob, she had never found someone to champion her creative spirit. Instead, she had learned to channel her artistic impulses into teaching, finding subtle ways to nurture imagination within the accepted boundaries of their faith. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention. David Fisher stood in the doorway, his face etched with concern about his son's growing interest in the outside world. "Sister Anna, might I have a word?" His voice carried the weight of a father's worry, mixed with the uncertainty of someone seeking guidance. Anna invited him in, knowing this conversation could change everything. Should she reveal her own past struggles? Would sharing her experience help bridge the gap between father and son? Or would it only serve to deepen the community's concerns about her influence on their children? The responsibility of her position as teacher pressed heavily upon her shoulders. "David, before you speak, there's something you should know about Jacob's writing," Anna began, carefully choosing her words. "His stories, they're not just idle tales. They're filled with our values, our teachings. He's finding new ways to understand our faith." She pulled out a folder containing Jacob's work, evidence of how he woven their community's principles into his narratives. David's eyes moved across the pages, his expression softening as he recognized familiar lessons, dressed in new clothes. "But Bishop Yoder says this interest in storytelling will lead him away from our ways," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Anna took a deep breath, knowing her next words could either heal or harm. "What if I told you that creativity and faith aren't enemies? That they can strengthen each other?" She opened her desk drawer and withdrew a worn notebook, its pages yellow with age. "These are poems I wrote when I was about Jacob's age. They helped me understand our faith more deeply." The revelation hung in the air between them. David's eyes widened slightly. Anna Zook, the respected teacher, had once struggled with the same questions now troubling his son. How many others in their community harbored similar secrets? How many hearts beat with unexpressed creativity beneath plain clothes and quiet demeanors? Morgan Freeman's words from earlier that week echoed in Anna's mind. "Stories are how we make sense of our world." Perhaps it was time for their community to examine how they could embrace new ways of understanding without losing their core values. But would Bishop Yoder see it that way? As David read through her childhood poems, Anna noticed something shift in his expression. The rigid lines of worry began to soften, replaced by recognition. "These words, they remind me of things my own mother used to say," he admitted quietly. "She had a way of making our teachings come alive through her stories at bedtime." This unexpected connection opened a door between them, leading to a deeper conversation about tradition, creativity, and the delicate balance between preserving their way of life and allowing their children's spirits to flourish. But as they talked, neither noticed the shadow that passed briefly across the schoolhouse window. Bishop Yoder had been listening, and Anna's secret was no longer her own. What would this revelation mean for Anna's position in the community? How would Bishop Yoder respond to learning that one of his most trusted teachers had her own history of creative expression? And most importantly, how would this disclosure affect Jacob's future and his relationship with storytelling? The autumn wind rustled through the cornfields as Jacob Fisher walked alongside Morgan Freeman on the dirt path leading away from the schoolhouse. The boy's mind churned with questions that had been building since Freeman's arrival in their community. How could someone honor both their faith and their creative spirit? The weight of this dilemma pressed heavily on his young shoulders. Freeman noticed Jacob's furrowed brow and the way he kicked small stones along the path. The actor had seen that same troubled expression countless times before in young artists struggling to find their voice. But Jacob's situation was uniquely complex, bound by traditions that stretched back generations. "Mr. Freeman," Jacob began, hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, "how do you know when a story is right to tell?" The question carried deeper implications than its simple words suggested, touching on the fundamental tension between personal expression and community values. Freeman considered his response carefully, aware that his words could influence not only Jacob's artistic journey but his spiritual one as well. He thought back to his own experiences, the times when storytelling had served as a bridge between different worlds and perspectives. The conversation between them drew the attention of Anna Zook, who watched from the schoolhouse window. Her recent confession to Jacob about her own creative struggles had opened a new dimension in their relationship. She recognized in Jacob's earnest discussion with Freeman the same yearning that had once filled her heart, the desire to reconcile artistic expression with religious devotion. Meanwhile, David Fisher observed the exchange from his fields, his hands pausing in their work. His son's growing relationship with Freeman stirred conflicting emotions. The pride he felt in Jacob's intellectual curiosity warred with his fear of Bishop Yoder's disapproval. David remembered his own childhood dreams, long since buried beneath layers of tradition and responsibility. Bishop Yoder's influence permeated the community like an invisible presence. His recent sermons had subtly referenced the dangers of outside influences, though he never mentioned Freeman by name. The bishop's concerns stemmed from a genuine desire to protect his flock, yet his rigid stance created ripples of tension throughout the community. Freeman drew from his years of experience as he formulated his response to Jacob's question. He understood that his answer needed to respect the delicate balance between inspiration and tradition. The actor had learned through his own journey that storytelling could serve as a powerful tool for preserving and strengthening faith rather than undermining it. Jacob listened intently as Freeman shared his perspective, his young mind working to bridge the gap between his community's beliefs and his growing passion for stories. The boy's questions reflected a wisdom beyond his years, demonstrating an understanding of the complex relationship between artistic expression and spiritual devotion. The conversation between mentor and student touched upon universal themes that resonated beyond the boundaries of their different worlds. How does one remain true to their beliefs while exploring new forms of expression? Can tradition and innovation coexist in harmony? These questions echoed through the minds of all those involved in Jacob's journey. Anna Zook found herself increasingly drawn into the ongoing dialogue between tradition and change. Her position as teacher placed her at the intersection of these competing forces, requiring her to balance her duty to the community with her desire to nurture her students' gifts. She recognized in Jacob's struggle echoes of her own past challenges. As the afternoon light began to fade, the conversation between Freeman and Jacob approached a crucial turning point. The boys' questions had evolved from simple curiosity about storytelling techniques to deeper explorations of faith, art, and identity. Their discussion would have far-reaching implications for not only Jacob's future, but potentially for the entire community's understanding of how tradition and creativity might coexist. The resolution to Jacob's question would require more than just Freeman's wisdom. It would demand the participation of the entire community in examining their beliefs about art, faith, and the power of stories to strengthen rather than diminish their way of life. How would Bishop Yoder respond to these emerging discussions? Could David Fisher find the courage to support his son's creative journey while maintaining his commitment to their faith? The autumn sun cast long shadows across the gathering field as members of the Amish community filed in, their dark clothing a stark contrast against the golden wheat stubble. Morgan Freeman stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching as families arrived in horse-drawn buggies and on foot, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. How would they receive his final message? Jacob Fisher fidgeted beside his father David, his small hands clasped tightly together. The boys' eyes never left Freeman, even as Bishop Yoder's commanding presence drew attention from the assembled crowd. The tension between tradition and change hung heavy in the air, much like the evening mist beginning to settle over the field. Anna Zook positioned herself strategically between the community members and Freeman, her role as mediator evident in her careful movements. She had spent the past weeks watching Jacob's growing enthusiasm for storytelling, witnessing firsthand how it had sparked something vital in her young student. Yet she could feel Bishop Yoder's disapproving gaze from across the gathering, reminding her of her precarious position. The murmur of conversation died down as Bishop Yoder stepped forward, his stern countenance softened slightly by the gravity of the moment. "We have gathered today to hear from our visitor," he announced, the pause before visitor carrying weighted meaning. "Our ways are simple, Mr. Freeman. We ask that you respect this as you share your final words with us. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Bishop Yoder's influence permeated the community like an invisible presence. His recent sermons had subtly referenced the dangers of outside influences, though he never mentioned Freeman by name. The bishop's concerns stemmed from a genuine desire to protect his flock, yet his rigid stance created ripples of tension throughout the community. Freeman drew from his years of experience as he formulated his response to Jacob's question. He understood that his answer needed to respect the delicate balance between inspiration and tradition. The actor had learned through his own journey that storytelling could serve as a powerful tool for preserving and strengthening faith, rather than undermining it. Jacob listened intently as Freeman shared his perspective, his young mind working to bridge the gap between his community's beliefs and his growing passion for stories. The boy's questions reflected a wisdom beyond his years, demonstrating an understanding of the complex relationship between artistic expression and spiritual devotion. The conversation between mentor and student touched upon universal themes that resonated beyond the boundaries of their different worlds. How does one remain true to their beliefs while exploring new forms of expression? Can tradition and innovation coexist in harmony? These questions echoed through the minds of all those involved in Jacob's journey. Anna Zook found herself increasingly drawn into the ongoing dialogue between tradition and change. Her position as teacher placed her at the intersection of these competing forces, requiring her to balance her duty to the community with her desire to nurture her students' gifts. She recognized in Jacob's struggle echoes of her own past challenges. As the afternoon light began to fade, the conversation between Freeman and Jacob approached a crucial turning point. The boys' questions had evolved from simple curiosity about storytelling techniques to deeper explorations of faith, art, and identity. Their discussion would have far-reaching implications for not only Jacob's future, but potentially for the entire community's understanding of how tradition and creativity might coexist. The resolution to Jacob's question would require more than just Freeman's wisdom. It would demand the participation of the entire community in examining their beliefs about art, faith, and the power of stories to strengthen rather than diminish their way of life. How would Bishop Yoder respond to these emerging discussions? Could David Fisher find the courage to support his son's creative journey while maintaining his commitment to their faith? The autumn sun cast long shadows across the gathering field as members of the Amish community filed in, their dark clothing a stark contrast against the golden wheat stubble. Morgan Freeman stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching as families arrived in horse-drawn buggies and on foot, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. How would they receive his final message? Jacob Fisher fidgeted beside his father David, his small hands clasped tightly together. The boys' eyes never left Freeman, even as Bishop Yoder's commanding presence drew attention from the assembled crowd. The tension between tradition and change hung heavy in the air, much like the evening mist beginning to settle over the field. Anna Zook positioned herself strategically between the community members and Freeman, her role as mediator evident in her careful movements. She had spent the past weeks watching Jacob's growing enthusiasm for storytelling, witnessing firsthand how it had sparked something vital in her young student. Yet she could feel Bishop Yoder's disapproving gaze from across the gathering, reminding her of her precarious position. The murmur of conversation died down as Bishop Yoder stepped forward, his stern countenance softened slightly by the gravity of the moment. "We have gathered today to hear from our visitor," he announced, the pause before visitor carrying weighted meaning. "Our ways are simple, Mr. Freeman. We ask that you respect this as you share your final words with us. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." As Freeman's narrative unfolded, Bishop Yoder's stern expression began to soften imperceptibly. The tale spoke of wisdom passed down through generations, of the strength found in roots deeply planted in faith and tradition. But it also revealed how those very roots could nurture new growth, allowing the tree of community to reach higher while remaining firmly grounded. The bishop's hands, folded tightly in his lap, gradually relaxed. Jacob's father, David, found himself drawn into the story despite his initial resistance. The familiar rhythms of agricultural life spoke to his own experiences, while the underlying message challenged his assumptions about change and tradition. Could there be truth in both the old ways and the new? His son's passion for stories had always seemed like a threat to their way of life, but Freeman's parable painted a different picture. The story reached its climax as the two brothers in the tale finally came together, discovering that their father's true legacy lay not in the specific methods they used, but in the values those methods were meant to preserve. Freeman's voice carried the wisdom of ages as he described how the brothers learned to honor their heritage while allowing for growth and adaptation. Who among the listeners could deny the truth in this message? Anna noticed tears in Jacob's eyes as the story drew to a close. The boy understood, perhaps better than anyone, how stories could preserve and strengthen the very traditions they seemed to challenge. His own writing, hidden away in carefully maintained notebooks, had always sought to capture the beauty and wisdom of his community's way of life. Bishop Yoder sat motionless as Freeman's final words resonated through the room. The actor had chosen his parable carefully, weaving together threads of respect for tradition with the gentle suggestion that growth and change could strengthen rather than threaten their way of life. The silence that followed felt charged with possibility. David Fisher found himself looking at his son with new eyes. The boy's gift for storytelling, which had seemed like a dangerous deviation from their path, now appeared in a different light. Could Jacob's stories serve as bridges, helping their community preserve its values while engaging with a changing world? The father's hands, calloused from years of working the land, clenched and unclenched as he wrestled with this new perspective. Freeman remained standing, his presence both powerful and humble as the impact of his words settled over the gathering. He had not come to challenge or change the Amish way of life, but to demonstrate how stories could strengthen and preserve what mattered most to this community. The tension in the room began to transform into something else, a shared understanding that perhaps tradition and creativity were not enemies after all. How would this moment reshape the community's future? The answer lay in the thoughtful silence of Bishop Yoder, the hopeful eyes of young Jacob, the contemplative expression of David Fisher, and the gentle smile of Anna Zook. Freeman's parable had planted a seed, but its growth would depend on how the community chose to nurture it. In the hushed aftermath of Freeman's parable, the Amish community of Lancaster County found itself in a rare moment of collective contemplation. The story had touched something deep within their hearts, leaving them to wrestle with questions that challenged the very foundation of their beliefs. How could they preserve their sacred traditions while nurturing the divine spark of creativity that lived within their children? Bishop Eli Yoder sat alone in his study, his weathered hands folded atop his worn Bible. Freeman's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront memories of his own youth, times when he too had felt the pull of expression beyond the strict boundaries of their ways. Had he perhaps been too rigid, too fearful of change? The thought unsettled him, yet he couldn't dismiss it as easily as he once might have. Across the community, Anna Zook stood at her classroom window, watching as her students played in the schoolyard. Her gaze settled on Jacob Fisher, who sat, apart from the others, scribbling intently in his notebook. She recognized in him the same yearning she had suppressed in herself years ago, the desire to capture beauty through words. Freeman's visit had awakened something in her students, particularly Jacob, that both thrilled and frightened her. David Fisher found himself in his barn, mechanically going through his evening chores while his mind wandered to darker territories. What kind of father was he, to feel such conflict over his son's gift? He remembered Jacob as a toddler, spinning tales even before he could properly speak, bringing light to their home with his imaginative spirit. When had that joy become something to fear? In the gathering dusk, Morgan Freeman sat on the porch of his temporary lodgings. Observing the peaceful farmland before him, he understood that his words had planted seeds that would take time to grow. The challenge wasn't in the telling of his story, but in helping this community find their own way to embrace both tradition and transformation. Jacob, unaware of the soul-searching his presence had sparked, lay in his bed that night, his mind alive with possibilities. Freeman's parable had shown him that stories could build bridges instead of walls, but could he find the courage to be that bridge for his community? His hand crept beneath his pillow, where he kept his most precious possession, the letter Freeman had sent him, now worn from countless readings. Throughout the community, families gathered for their evening meals in unusual silence. The customary prayers were spoken, but minds wandered to unspoken questions. What defined their faith more clearly? The rules they followed or the love they showed? Could they trust that their foundations were strong enough to withstand gentle changes? Anna Zook found herself unable to sleep, remembering the light in Jacob's eyes when Freeman spoke. She had always taught her students that God's love was infinite, but had they been limiting his means of expression? The moonlight streaming through her window seemed to write its own story across her floor, and she wondered if perhaps they had been reading God's messages too narrowly all along. Bishop Yoder's authority had always stemmed from his ability to provide clear answers, but now he faced questions that defied simple solutions. How could he guide his flock through this challenge without losing either their respect or their souls? The weight of this responsibility pressed upon him like a physical burden. As the night deepened, the community's silence spoke volumes. It was not the silence of resolution, but rather the quiet of metamorphosis, the sacred space between what was and what could be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, and perhaps new understanding. But for now, in the darkness of a Lancaster County night, hearts beat with unspoken hopes and unvoiced fears. What would morning bring to this community in transition? How would they begin to bridge the chasm between preservation and progress? The answers lay waiting in the dawn, but for now, they rested in the power of silence, where the deepest truths often take root. Bishop Yoder sat alone in his study, the weight of Freeman's words settling like dust in the corners of his mind. The actor's visit had stirred something in the community, a ripple that threatened to become a wave. How could mere stories hold such power? The question nagged at him like a loose thread on his plain black coat. Through his window, he observed Jacob Fisher walking home from school, clutching his books with the same reverence others reserved for scripture. The boy's recent transformation troubled the bishop deeply. What began as simple letters to a Hollywood actor had evolved into something far more complex, challenging the very foundations of their way of life. Anna Zook's role in this situation particularly vexed him. Her encouragement of Jacob's writing, while well-intentioned, seemed to blur the lines between education and rebellion. The schoolteacher had always shown good judgment before, but her recent decisions made him question whether she truly understood the gravity of her influence on young minds. David Fisher's position proved equally concerning. The father's struggle, between supporting his son's gifts and maintaining their traditional ways, reflected a larger battle within their community. Bishop Yoder recalled his own father's strict adherence to their customs, wondering if perhaps some wisdom had been lost in the rigid preservation of their lifestyle. Morgan Freeman's presence had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. The PU actor's respectful approach and genuine interest in their community challenged the bishop's preconceptions. Freeman hadn't arrived with the intent to disrupt or criticize, but rather to understand and share. Could there be merit in such exchange, or would it inevitably lead to the erosion of their carefully maintained separation from the English world? The memory of Freeman's storytelling session in the schoolhouse lingered. The children's faces had glowed with wonder, their minds clearly traveling beyond the confined boundaries of their daily existence. Even some adults had been moved, though they tried to hide it. The bishop found himself questioning whether such imagination truly threatened their faith, or if it might somehow enhance their understanding of God's creation. Young Jacob's writing particularly troubled him. The boy possessed an undeniable gift, one that seemed God-given. How could he reconcile the community's need to preserve their way of life with the possibility that they might be stifling divine talents? The bishop remembered his own childhood dreams, long ago buried under the weight of responsibility and tradition. Anna Zook's latest report on Jacob's progress revealed improved performance in all subjects, not just English. The boy's storytelling appeared to enhance his understanding of mathematics through problem-solving narratives, and his knowledge of history through creative retellings of past events. Could this be dismissed as mere coincidence, or was there something more profound at work? The question of change versus tradition had always been central to their faith. The Amish way emphasized stability, continuity, and resistance to the corrupting influences of the modern world. Yet even their ancestors had made choices about which traditions to keep and which to leave behind. Where did one draw the line between necessary adaptation and dangerous deviation? Freeman's parting words echoed in his mind. Stories don't destroy faith, Bishop Yoder. They help us understand it better. The actor had spoken with a wisdom that transcended their cultural differences, forcing the bishop to examine his own beliefs more deeply than he had in years. David Fisher's quiet suffering hadn't gone unnoticed either. The man's dedication to their way of life warred visibly with his love for his son, creating a tension that threatened to tear apart not just their family, but potentially the fabric of the community itself. As their spiritual leader, Bishop Yoder felt responsible for guiding them through this crisis. But the path forward remained unclear. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across his simple desk. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more decisions to make. The bishop reached for his Bible, seeking guidance in its familiar pages. Perhaps the answer lay not in choosing between tradition and creativity, but in finding a way to honor both. What would that look like in their community? How could they preserve their essential values while allowing room for the gifts God had bestowed upon their children? David Fisher's calloused hands moved methodically across the weathered wood of his workshop table, his thoughts as rough as the unfinished surface beneath his fingers. The evening's quietude offered little comfort as he contemplated the growing distance between himself and Jacob, his 10-year-old son, whose heart seemed increasingly drawn to a world beyond their Amish ways. What had Morgan Freeman awakened in his boy? The question haunted David as he recalled Jacob's animated expressions during dinner, the way his son's eyes sparkled when describing the stories Freeman had shared. Such enthusiasm should bring joy to a father's heart. Yet David felt only the weight of responsibility pressing down upon his shoulders. Through the workshop window, David observed Jacob in the garden, notebook in hand, lips moving silently as he crafted yet another tale. When had his son's imagination become such a source of concern? The memory of Bishop Yoder's stern warnings echoed in his mind, mixing with Anna Zook's gentle assertions about Jacob's gift for storytelling. A soft knock at the workshop door interrupted David's thoughts. Anna Zook stood in the doorway, her presence unexpected but not unwelcome. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, David," she said, holding a folder of papers. "I thought you might want to see something Jacob wrote in class today." David's initial instinct was to decline, to maintain the rigid boundary between school matters and home life. But something in Anna's expression gave him pause. What insights might she offer about his son that he had failed to see? The pages she presented contained more than just schoolwork. They revealed Jacob's heart laid bare through carefully chosen words. As David read, his son's voice emerged from the pages, telling a story about a father and son building a barn together. The details were precise, clearly drawn from David's own teachings, but woven through with an understanding that struck him deeply. How had Jacob captured the very essence of their shared moments, transforming simple carpentry lessons into something profound? The question of tradition versus individual expression had never seemed more complex. Morgan Freeman's influence had undeniably sparked something in Jacob, but as David continued reading, he recognized that his son's gift for storytelling had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Was it possible that such talent could serve rather than threaten their way of life? Anna watched quietly as David absorbed the words. Your son has a unique ability to bridge worlds, David. He takes our values, our daily work, and helps others understand their beauty through his stories. Her observation carried the weight of countless hours spent nurturing Jacob's talent in the classroom. David's mind turned to his own father, remembering how the old man had once modified traditional furniture designs to better serve their community's needs. Had that not been its own form of storytelling, speaking through wood instead of words? Perhaps Jacob's gift wasn't so different from the craftsmanship passed down through generations of fishermen. The workshop's familiar sense of sawdust and linseed oil surrounded David as he considered the parallel between his trade and his son's passion. Both required patience, attention to detail, and an understanding of how separate elements could be joined to create something meaningful. Could Jacob's stories, like well-crafted furniture, serve a purpose within their community? Morgan Freeman's presence had forced them all to examine their assumptions about tradition and change. David realized that his resistance to his son's gift might stem more from fear than wisdom. What if supporting Jacob's storytelling didn't mean losing him to the English world, but rather helping him find his place within their own? The sound of Jacob's voice drifted through the window as he shared a story with his younger siblings in the garden. David moved closer, listening not just to the words but to the way his son crafted them, building characters and scenes with the same care David applied to his woodworking. When had he last truly listened to Jacob's stories without judgment or fear? Anna's quiet presence reminded David that he wasn't alone in guiding Jacob's journey. The community that Bishop Yoder sought to protect might be strong enough to embrace this child's gift without compromising its foundations. But first, David would need to bridge the gap growing between father and son. What would happen if, instead of resisting Jacob's stories, David offered his own? Could sharing tales of his youth, of the lessons learned at his father's workbench, help Jacob understand that storytelling had always been part of their tradition, even if not in written form? The possibility of connecting with his son through shared narratives suddenly seemed like a path worth exploring. The morning sun cast long shadows across Anna Zook's classroom as she contemplated the empty desks before her. 35 years of life in the Amish community had taught her the delicate balance between upholding tradition and nurturing young minds. But Morgan Freeman's visit had stirred something deeper within her professional conscience. How could she honor both her calling as a teacher and her duty to the community? The previous day's events with Jacob Fisher and his father David had spread through the community like wildfire, leaving Anna to navigate increasingly treacherous waters. Bishop Yoder's disapproval of Freeman's influence hung over the schoolhouse like a storm cloud. Yet she couldn't deny the positive change she'd witnessed in her students, particularly Jacob, since the actor's arrival. As she arranged the books for the day's lessons, Anna's mind wandered to her own childhood, when her father had caught her writing stories by candlelight. He hadn't scolded her, but rather guided her toward using her gift in service of the community. Why couldn't the same principle apply to Jacob's storytelling? The first students began filtering into the classroom, their curious eyes taking in the slight changes she'd made to the daily schedule posted on the board. Today's English lesson would incorporate elements of oral tradition, a subtle nod to both their heritage and the art of storytelling. Would Bishop Yoder see this as defiance, or as a thoughtful integration of old and new? Anna watched as Jacob took his seat, his face bright with an inner light that hadn't been there before Freeman's arrival. The boy had always been different, quieter, more observant, with questions that went beyond the standard curriculum. His recent interactions with Morgan Freeman had only amplified these qualities, and Anna found herself wondering if suppressing such gifts truly served their community's best interests. During the morning lesson, she introduced a new exercise, asking students to share stories passed down through their families. The enthusiasm in the room was palpable as children recounted tales of their grandparents' journeys, of harvest celebrations, and of community triumphs over hardship. Jacob's hand shot up repeatedly, each story he shared demonstrating an innate understanding of narrative structure that amazed even Anna. But it was during the afternoon session that Anna's resolve was truly tested. Bishop Yoder made an unannounced visit to the schoolhouse, his stern presence sending a ripple of tension through the room. As he observed from the back, Anna continued with her lesson, carefully weaving traditional teachings with opportunities for creative expression. Would he recognize her attempt to bridge the gap between preservation and growth? The bishop's expression remained unreadable as he watched Jacob lead a group exercise, the young boy's natural ability to engage his peers evident in every gesture and word. Anna felt her heart race as she noticed David Fisher standing in the doorway, drawn perhaps by curiosity about his son's school activities since their recent breakthrough. In that moment, Anna realized that her role extended beyond merely teaching reading and arithmetic. She was helping to shape the future of their community, one that could either embrace or reject the unique gifts of each child. The question wasn't whether to support Jacob's storytelling abilities, but how to do so while honoring their way of life. As the school day drew to a close, Anna found herself composing a letter to Morgan Freeman, seeking his insight on how to nurture creativity within the bounds of tradition. She understood now that her position as teacher placed her at the intersection of past and future, of preservation and progress. Could she find a way to support Jacob's gift while maintaining the respect of Bishop Yoder and the community? The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her writing. Bishop Yoder had remained behind after the other students left. His presence demanded a conversation that would either validate or challenge her teaching methods. Anna straightened her spine, drawing strength from the conviction that supporting her students' gifts, including Jacob's storytelling, was not just her choice, but her responsibility as an educator. What followed would determine not only Jacob's future, but potentially the way creativity and tradition could coexist within their community. Would Anna's courage to stand firm in her beliefs inspire others to recognize the value of nurturing each child's unique talents? And how would her actions impact the delicate balance between Morgan Freeman's influence and Bishop Yoder's authority? News traveled swiftly through Lancaster County's Amish community, carried on whispers as delicate as autumn leaves. Morgan Freeman's presence at the schoolhouse had sparked conversations in every home, barn, and marketplace. How could one afternoon of storytelling create such ripples in their carefully ordered world? The discussions began innocently enough at Rachel Stoltzfus's quilting circle, where several mothers gathered to work and share news of their children. "My Sarah hasn't stopped talking about the Englishman's visit," one woman mentioned, her needle moving steadily through the fabric. "She says he made the stories come alive like she's never heard before." The other women exchanged knowing glances, their hands never pausing in their work. At the community mill, where David Fisher brought his weekly grain, the men's conversations carried a different tone. "Bishop Yoder says this Freeman fellow is putting strange ideas in the children's heads," Samuel Lapp commented while loading his wagon. David remained silent, torn between his community's traditions and his son Jacob's newfound passion. How could he reconcile these competing forces in his heart? Anna Zook noticed subtle changes in her classroom. Students who had once been reluctant to participate now raised their hands eagerly during reading time. They asked questions about characters and plot lines, showing a depth of understanding that both thrilled and concerned her. Would this newfound enthusiasm for learning be seen as a threat to their way of life? The ripple effect reached beyond the schoolhouse walls. Young Jacob Fisher's writing had improved dramatically, and other students began following his example. Their compositions showed imagination and creativity that had never before appeared in their simple daily journals. Anna carefully preserved these writings, knowing they represented something precious and potentially controversial. Bishop Yoder received visitors almost daily now, community members seeking guidance about this unexpected situation. Should they be concerned about their children's growing interest in storytelling? Was this English influence leading their young ones away from the path of simplicity? The bishop listened to each concern with grave attention, weighing his responses carefully against the preservation of their faith and traditions. Meanwhile, Morgan Freeman's impact extended beyond just the children. Several young adults in the community began questioning the strict limitations on creative expression. They whispered among themselves about the power of stories to teach and inspire, just as their own religious parables did. These conversations happened in hushed tones during barn raisings and harvest gatherings, away from the ears of community elders. The situation created unexpected allies and divisions. Some parents, seeing their children's academic improvement, secretly approved of Anna's new teaching methods. Others feared this change represented the first crack in their community's foundation. Who would have thought that one afternoon of storytelling could raise such fundamental questions about their way of life? David Fisher found himself at the center of these community currents. His son's writing had drawn attention from both supporters and critics. During Sunday services, he felt the weight of scrutiny from his neighbors. Were they judging his parenting choices? How could he protect his son's gift while maintaining their traditional values? Anna Zook walked a precarious line between her duties as a traditional Amish teacher and her belief in nurturing her students' talents. Each morning, she carefully reviewed her lesson plans, searching for ways to blend creativity with convention. Could she find a balance that would satisfy both Bishop Yoder and her own conscience? The whispers grew louder when word spread that Jacob had been exchanging letters with Morgan Freeman. This communication with the outside world represented exactly what many community members feared most. Yet others secretly admired the boy's courage to pursue his passion for storytelling, seeing in his actions a reflection of their own unspoken desires for creative expression. These community conversations revealed deeper questions about the nature of tradition and change. How could they preserve their way of life while allowing their children to develop their God-given talents? Was there room within their faith for creative expression that went beyond their traditional forms? As autumn progressed, these whispers wove themselves into the fabric of daily life, creating a tapestry of concern, hope, and uncertainty. The community stood at a crossroads, watching as their carefully maintained world began to shift beneath their feet. What changes would this winter bring to their close-knit community? And more importantly, how would they navigate these uncharted waters while keeping their faith and traditions intact? The soft scratch of pencil against paper filled the quiet barn as Jacob Fisher hunched over his notebook, stolen moments of creativity illuminated by a single lantern. His heart raced with each word he wrote, both from excitement and fear of discovery. The story flowing from his pencil wasn't just any tale. It was his story, born from the seeds Morgan Freeman had planted during his visits to the schoolhouse. What would Freeman think of these humble beginnings? The thought both thrilled and terrified Jacob as he considered his mentor's potential reaction. The story centered around a young Amish boy who discovered a magical book that allowed him to visit different worlds while never leaving his community. A reflection, perhaps, of Jacob's own yearning to explore beyond the boundaries of his daily life. Anna Zook had noticed the change in Jacob during school hours. While other students focused solely on their assigned readings, Jacob's eyes often drifted to the window, his mind clearly wandering to distant places. Rather than reprimand him, she recognized the same spark she had seen in Freeman's eyes when he spoke of the power of storytelling. During recess, she had quietly slipped him an extra notebook, their shared secret sealed with nothing more than a knowing smile. The weight of secrecy bore heavily on Jacob's young shoulders. His father, David Fisher, had grown increasingly distant since Freeman's visits began, spending more time in consultation with Bishop Yoder. The whispered conversations between the two men often fell silent when Jacob entered the room, leaving him to wonder what judgments were being passed about his growing interest in stories. Would his father understand that these stories weren't just idle fantasies? They were bridges. Bridges between the world he knew and the one he glimpsed through Freeman's tales. Each word Jacob wrote felt like both a betrayal and a liberation. How could something that felt so right be considered so wrong by those he respected most? Bishop Yoder's influence cast a long shadow over the community. His recent sermons had taken on a pointed tone, speaking of the dangers of worldly influences and the importance of maintaining their way of life. Though he never mentioned Freeman by name, his meaning was clear to all who listened. The bishop's words carried weight, yet they also sparked questions in Jacob's mind about the nature of storytelling itself. Hadn't their own history been preserved, through stories passed down through generations? The relationship between Freeman and Bishop Yoder had become a subtle dance of mutual respect, tinged with fundamental disagreement. Freeman's visits to the school had become less frequent, but his impact remained. He had shown Jacob how stories could capture truth without compromising faith, a concept that seemed to elude the bishop's understanding. Anna Zook found herself walking an increasingly precarious line. Her position as teacher required her to uphold community values, yet she couldn't deny the positive changes she observed in Jacob and other students who had been touched by Freeman's influence. Their writing had become more vivid, their comprehension deeper, their curiosity more engaged. How could she nurture these gifts while maintaining her responsibilities to the community? As Jacob continued writing, his story began to take on layers he hadn't initially intended. The magical book in his tale became more than just a portal to adventure. It became a vessel for understanding different perspectives, much like the stories Freeman had shared. Through his character's journey, Jacob found himself exploring questions about tradition, change, and the power of understanding between different worlds. The barn door creaked, causing Jacob to quickly hide his notebook beneath some hay. His father's footsteps approached, and Jacob held his breath, wondering if this moment would become the confrontation he had been dreading. Would his father understand that this secret writing was not a rejection of their way of life, but rather an attempt to understand it more deeply? David Fisher's relationship with his son had reached a crucial crossroads. He recognized the intelligence and creativity in his boy, traits that reminded him of his own younger days when he had harbored dreams beyond the boundaries of their community. But those dreams had given way to the practical responsibilities of Amish life. Now watching his son struggle with similar yearnings, David faced his own internal conflict between protective father and understanding parent. The tension between tradition and personal expression that Freeman had inadvertently introduced to the community continued to ripple outward, touching each person in unexpected ways. For Jacob, alone in the barn with his hidden stories, these ripples had become waves of possibility, carrying him toward an uncertain but exciting future. What would emerge from this secret beginning? Only time, and perhaps a few more pages, would tell. The autumn wind carried more than fallen leaves through Lancaster County that morning. It brought whispers of change that made Bishop Eli Yoder's shoulders feel heavier than usual. As he sat in his study, the weight of Morgan Freeman's presence in their community pressed upon him like an unwanted truth that refused to be ignored. How could mere stories cause such upheaval among his people? Before him lay several pieces of paper, letters exchanged between the visiting actor and young Jacob Fisher. The boy's words reflected a passion that troubled the bishop deeply, not for their content but for what they represented. Each carefully crafted sentence demonstrated a pull away from the simplicity their faith demanded. Yet there was something in Jacob's writing that stirred memories of his own youth, when words held magic and possibilities seemed endless. The matter had reached a critical point when Anna Zook approached him earlier that week. The school teacher's usual confidence had been tempered with concern as she shared her observations of Jacob's growing abilities. "The boy has a gift," she had said, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "His stories bring light to our lessons in ways I never expected." The bishop had listened, noting how she chose her words carefully, respecting his authority while advocating for her student. David Fisher's visit the previous evening had complicated matters further. Jacob's father spoke of changes in his son, both troubling and transformative. The boy who once struggled to express himself now filled pages with tales that, while simple, captured the essence of their community's values. But was this gift a blessing or a threat to their way of life? Morgan Freeman's influence had extended beyond Jacob, touching others in ways that challenged the bishop's understanding of storytelling's role in their faith. Several families had reported their children asking questions about the broader world, inspired by the stories they'd heard. These questions, while innocent, carried the potential to upset the delicate balance of their isolated community. The decision before Bishop Yoder transcended the simple matter of allowing or forbidding storytelling. It cut to the heart of their faith's future. How could they preserve their ways while acknowledging the undeniable impact of narrative on human understanding? The same parables that taught their children about faith were, after all, stories themselves. As he contemplated the situation, a memory surfaced of his own grandfather sharing tales by candlelight, weaving lessons of faith and community into stories that still guided his actions today. Had those moments not shaped his path toward leadership? Had they not strengthened rather than weakened his commitment to their way of life? The conversation with Freeman earlier that day echoed in his mind. The actor had spoken with unexpected humility about the power of stories to bridge differences and reinforce values rather than undermine them. "Stories don't change people, Bishop Yoder," Freeman had said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "They simply help us understand who we already are." The bishop's quill hovered over the blank paper before him as he considered the ripples his decision would create. Anna Zook's teaching methods had always respected their traditions while nurturing her students' growth. Could storytelling, properly guided, serve a similar purpose? The question wasn't whether to allow stories, but how to ensure they strengthened, rather than weakened, their community's foundations. David Fisher's struggle reflected the broader community's concerns. How could they embrace their children's gifts while maintaining the boundaries that protected their way of life? The answer perhaps lay not in rigid restrictions but in thoughtful guidance, teaching their young to use their talents in service of their faith rather than in opposition to it. Jacob's latest story sat atop the pile of papers, a simple tale about a farmer learning patience through tending his fields. The bishop found himself moved by how the boy had captured the essence of their values through his words. Could this be the bridge between preservation and growth that their community needed? The decision crystallizing in Bishop Yoder's mind would require courage and wisdom to implement. It would mean finding a balance between protecting their traditions and allowing them to be strengthened through new forms of expression. But wasn't that the true test of leadership? Knowing when to bend so that nothing essential would break? What role would stories play in their community's future? How could they harness this powerful tool while staying true to their principles? The answers would emerge not through prohibition, but through careful cultivation of their children's gifts, within the framework of their faith. Morgan Freeman stood at the window of his hotel room overlooking the rolling Lancaster County farmland, his thoughts drifting to the remarkable events that had unfolded during his visit to the Amish community. The setting sun cast long shadows across the fields where horse-drawn plows had carved neat furrows into the earth, much like the deep impressions this experience had etched into his consciousness. What had begun as a simple response to a child's letter had evolved into something far more profound. Young Jacob Fisher's words had touched something in Freeman's soul, compelling him to venture into a world so different from his own. How many other Jacobs were out there, he wondered, their creative spirits yearning for expression within the bounds of tradition? The conversation with Bishop Yoder earlier that day still resonated in his mind. The elder's stern demeanor had gradually softened as they discussed the power of storytelling, not as a threat to faith, but as a means of strengthening it. Freeman recalled how the bishop's eyes had shown a glimmer of understanding when he spoke, of parables and their role in teaching eternal truths. Anna Zook's quiet courage had left an indelible impression on Freeman. Her dedication to nurturing her students' minds while respecting the community's values demonstrated a delicate balance he hadn't fully appreciated before. She had shown him how innovation could exist within tradition, like a flower growing through the cracks in a stone wall. The transformation in David Fisher had been particularly moving. Freeman remembered the father's initial resistance, the way he had stood rigid and uncertain during their first meeting. But watching David gradually open his heart to his son's gift had revealed the universal nature of parental love. Wasn't that itself a story worth telling? Jacob's growth throughout this journey stirred Freeman's emotions the most. The boy's eager face appeared in his mind, bright with possibility, yet tempered by an understanding of his responsibilities to family and faith. Freeman had witnessed Jacob's storytelling abilities blossom, not in rebellion against his community's values, but in harmony with them. But questions lingered in Freeman's mind. Had he done right by this community? Would the seeds of change he'd helped plant grow into something beautiful? Or would they create unforeseen challenges? The weight of influence carried its own responsibilities, and he felt them keenly now. The relationship between tradition and progress was complex, Freeman reflected. Like the intricate quilts the Amish women crafted, each piece had its place in the larger pattern. Perhaps that was the real story here. Not a tale of old versus new, but of how both could be woven together to create something stronger and more meaningful. Freeman's thoughts turned to his own journey as a storyteller. How many times had he questioned the impact of his work? Yet here, in this unexpected place, he had witnessed the raw power of narrative to bridge divides and open hearts. The Amish community had taught him as much as he had shared with them. The sound of a horse and buggy clip-clopping down the road drew his attention. He watched as it passed below, its steady pace a reminder of the deliberate way the Amish moved through life. There was wisdom in that measured approach, he realized, just as there was wisdom in knowing when to embrace change. Tomorrow, he would leave this place, but its lessons would remain. The story of Jacob Fisher, Bishop Yoder, Anna Zook, and the entire community would join the countless others he carried in his heart. Each had contributed to a larger narrative about human connection and the enduring power of stories to transform lives. As darkness settled over the landscape, Freeman began composing a letter in his mind, not to Jacob this time, but to himself. What would he say about this experience in years to come? How would he describe the moment when an Amish boy's letter led him to discover new dimensions of his own craft? The answers would unfold in their own time, like all good stories do. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Fisher farm as David watched his son Jacob complete his evening chores. The boy's movements were mechanical, his mind clearly elsewhere as he scattered feed for the chickens. Who could blame him? The past few days had brought more excitement to their small Amish community than the previous 10 years combined, all because of Morgan Freeman's unexpected visit. David found himself wrestling with thoughts that challenged everything he'd known. How could something as simple as storytelling create such turmoil within their peaceful community? Bishop Yoder's words echoed in his mind, warnings about the dangers of outside influence. Yet there was something else there too, the unmistakable light in Jacob's eyes when he spoke of the stories he wanted to tell. What would Sarah have done? David often found himself asking this question when faced with difficult decisions about their son. His late wife had always possessed a wisdom that went beyond their traditional teachings, seeing the heart of matters that others missed. Would she have seen Freeman's presence as a threat, or as something more? The memory of yesterday's community gathering lingered fresh in David's mind. He had watched Freeman interact with the children, noting how the visitor never once attempted to undermine their ways or beliefs. Instead, Freeman had woven tales that celebrated simple virtues, the very same values their community held dear. How could such stories be a threat to their way of life? Through the barn door, David observed Jacob pausing his work to scribble something in the small notebook Anna Zook had given him. The sight would have ordinarily prompted a stern reminder about staying focused on chores, but today David remained silent. He recalled his own childhood dreams, the ones he'd set aside in favor of tradition and responsibility. Had that really been the only path? The question of tradition versus individual calling weighed heavily on David's conscience. Bishop Yoder had always taught that their way of life was about submission to God's will, but hadn't God also blessed each person with unique gifts? Jacob's ability to capture the imagination of others with his words seemed as natural as breathing. Could such a gift truly be wrong? David remembered the conversation he'd overheard between Freeman and Bishop Yoder, their words carrying across the meeting house yard. Freeman had spoken of how stories could bridge understanding between different peoples, while preserving the very traditions the bishop sought to protect. The actor's wisdom had struck a chord that David couldn't ignore. The sound of approaching footsteps drew David's attention. Anna Zook was making her way toward the barn, likely checking on Jacob's progress with his studies. She had been careful in her support of Jacob's storytelling, always ensuring it remained within the boundaries of their faith. Her presence had been a steadying force throughout this upheaval. "Jacob," David called out, making a decision that had been forming in his heart for days. His son looked up, quickly trying to hide the notebook. "Those stories you're writing, are they about our people? Our ways?" Jacob nodded hesitantly, uncertain of his father's intent. David stepped closer, choosing his next words carefully. Perhaps there's wisdom in keeping our stories alive through more than just spoken words. Our ways are precious because they connect us to those who came before. Maybe writing them down isn't so different from what our elders have always done, passing on what matters most. The boy's eyes widened with understanding. It wasn't explicit permission, but rather an acknowledgement that some changes could strengthen rather than weaken their traditions. David saw Anna Zook smile softly from the barn entrance, her expression reflecting the delicate balance they were all trying to maintain. This small moment of acceptance represented more than just a father's permission to his son. It marked a subtle shift in how their community might preserve their heritage while allowing for gentle growth. The challenge would be helping Bishop Yoder and others see that embracing Jacob's gift didn't mean abandoning their ways, but rather finding new paths to protect them. As Jacob returned to his chores with renewed energy, David wondered what tomorrow would bring. Change was coming to their community, as subtle as a shift in the wind. The question wasn't whether to resist it entirely, but how to guide it with wisdom and grace. Perhaps that had been Freeman's greatest lesson all along. The morning sun filtered through the schoolhouse windows as Anna Zook stood before her class, her mind wandering to the conversation she'd had with Morgan Freeman weeks ago. His words about the power of stories had taken root, growing quietly, like seeds in fertile soil. How could she honor both tradition and the natural creativity of her students? Jacob Fisher sat attentively in the third row, his quill poised above his notebook. Since his father's subtle nod of approval toward his storytelling interests, a new confidence had emerged in the boy's demeanor. The change hadn't gone unnoticed by Anna, who recognized the delicate balance she needed to maintain between nurturing Jacob's gift and respecting Bishop Yoder's authority. Today, Anna announced, her voice carrying a hint of carefully measured excitement, "We will approach our scripture lesson differently." She watched as 20 young faces lifted toward her, curiosity evident in their expressions. "Instead of simply reading the passage, I want each of you to think about how you would tell this story to a younger sibling." The suggestion was simple enough to avoid raising immediate concerns, yet revolutionary in its subtle shift from rote learning to personal interpretation. Anna's heart quickened as she observed her students' reactions. Some appeared confused by this departure from their usual routine, while others, like Jacob, straightened in their seats with newfound interest. As the children worked, Anna circulated through the classroom, listening to their whispered attempts at storytelling. She paused near Jacob's desk, where he was helping Sarah Stoltzfus find her voice in retelling the story of David and Goliath. The interaction between the two students demonstrated exactly what Morgan Freeman had spoken about, the natural human connection that emerged through shared stories. The changes Anna implemented were small, almost imperceptible to an outside observer. A few extra minutes for discussion after reading passages, encouraging students to relate biblical lessons to their daily lives, allowing them to work in pairs to practice retelling stories they'd learned. These subtle adjustments created ripples of engagement throughout her classroom, transforming the traditional learning environment into something more dynamic. But with each small step forward, Anna felt the weight of Bishop Yoder's potential scrutiny. Would he see these changes as a threat to their way of life? How long could she maintain this delicate balance between innovation and tradition? The questions nagged at her as she watched her students flourish under the new approach. One particular morning, as Anna prepared for class, she discovered a carefully folded note on her desk. The handwriting belonged to Rachel Lapp, one of her quietest students. The message inside brought tears to her eyes. "Teacher Zook, I told my little brother the story of Noah's Ark last night. He understood it better than when Ma'am reads it to him." The note validated what Anna had hoped, that teaching children to engage with stories personally would strengthen, not weaken, their connection to their faith and community. Yet she couldn't help but wonder about the cost of these changes. Would Bishop Yoder eventually hear about her modified teaching methods? What would David Fisher think about his son's growing confidence in storytelling? As winter approached, Anna noticed more parents lingering after school, listening to their children enthusiastically sharing what they'd learned. Even some of the more conservative families seemed caught off guard by their children's deeper understanding of Scripture and improved ability to articulate its meanings. The children had become more than passive recipients of knowledge. They were now active participants in their own learning. The transformation extended beyond religious instruction. During arithmetic lessons, students began creating story problems about farm life and family situations. Reading sessions evolved into opportunities for students to connect with the material on a personal level. Anna observed how this approach helped them retain information better while developing critical thinking skills. But perhaps the most significant change was in Jacob Fisher himself. The boy who once hidden his storytelling gift now helped younger students find their voices. His natural ability to weave narratives had become a tool for learning rather than a source of shame. Anna sometimes caught herself wondering what Morgan Freeman would think of these developments, how he might smile at the way his influence had sparked such subtle yet meaningful change. As the seasons turned and the changes in Anna's classroom took root, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of her role as a teacher. The question was no longer about preserving tradition versus embracing change, but rather about finding ways to strengthen their community's foundations through the timeless power of storytelling. Would this realization be enough to convince Bishop Yoder if he ever questioned her methods? Only time would tell. The autumn winds carried change through Lancaster County, subtle yet persistent as the falling leaves. In the weeks following Morgan Freeman's visit to the Amish community, whispers of transformation began to take root, particularly within Anna Zook's schoolhouse. The traditional one-room school, once strictly adherent to practical teachings, now harbored moments where stories breathed life into lessons. Anna noticed the shift first in her students' eyes. Where once there had been mere dutiful attention, she now saw sparks of imagination when she incorporated tales into her mathematics problems or used parables to illustrate moral teachings. Jacob Fisher, especially, flourished under this new approach, his hand constantly raised to contribute a story that helped his classmates understand complex concepts. The change extended beyond the schoolhouse walls. During Sunday gatherings, Bishop Yoder observed more engaged discussions among the youth, their questions about Scripture deeper and more thoughtful. Though he'd initially opposed Freeman's influence, he couldn't deny that the children's understanding of biblical lessons had grown more profound. They weren't just reciting verses, they were exploring their meanings through the lens of storytelling. David Fisher witnessed the transformation in his own home. During evening meals, Jacob's stories no longer brought tension to the table. Instead, they served as bridges, connecting daily experiences with valuable lessons about faith, community, and tradition. One evening, as Jacob related a tale about helping a neighbor's horse, David found himself drawn into the narrative, recognizing how his son's gift for storytelling actually reinforced their Amish values rather than threatened them. Anna's teaching methods evolved carefully, always mindful of the delicate balance between innovation and tradition. She introduced sharing circles where students could express their daily experiences through story, but always tied them back to Scripture or practical learning. The approach caught the attention of teachers from neighboring districts who quietly began incorporating similar methods in their own classrooms. Morgan Freeman's influence lingered in unexpected ways. Letters between him and Jacob continued, but now they included questions about how stories could serve the community. The young boy's writings reflected a growing understanding of how to blend his passion with his heritage. Freeman's responses always emphasized respect for tradition, while encouraging Jacob to find his unique voice within those boundaries. Bishop Yoder's perspective underwent the most subtle yet significant shift. During a council meeting with other church leaders, he found himself sharing an anecdote to illustrate a point about community unity. The realization that he too was a storyteller came as a quiet epiphany. Perhaps, he reflected, the art of narrative had always been woven into their fabric, from the parables of Jesus to the oral histories passed down through generations. The community's women began incorporating storytelling into their quilting circles, sharing tales as they stitched. These stories, once considered mere gossip, took on new meaning as vehicles for preserving family histories and teaching younger generations. Even the most traditional members of the community found themselves drawn into these narrative exchanges. Anna observed these changes with careful optimism. During a parent-teacher meeting, she noticed how conversations naturally flowed into storytelling, with parents sharing tales of their own school days. These moments created connections that strengthened the community's bonds, rather than weakened them as many had feared. David Fisher's transformation manifested in unexpected moments. One evening, he found himself asking Jacob to tell him a story about his day at school. The surprise and joy in his son's eyes spoke volumes about the healing taking place between them. As Jacob wove his tale, David recognized elements of their Amish values skillfully embedded within the narrative. The seeds of change planted during Freeman's visit grew slowly but steadily, like the community's autumn crops. They took root in the fertile soil of tradition, nourished by the wisdom of the past while reaching toward new possibilities. How would these seeds continue to grow? What fruits would they bear in the seasons to come? The answers lay in the stories yet to be told, in the voices yet to be heard, and in the hearts yet to be opened. Through it all, Jacob continued to write, in his journal, recording the subtle shifts he observed in his community. His stories now carried the weight of both tradition and possibility, each word a testament to the power of narrative to bridge the gap between what was and what could be. The future remained unwritten, but the pages were no longer blank. As Morgan Freeman's car wound its way down the dusty Lancaster County road, the gentle clip-clop of horse hooves echoed behind him. Jacob Fisher sat perched atop his father's buggy, watching the modern vehicle disappear into the distance. The boy's notebook, filled with stories and dreams, pressed against his chest like a shield of possibility. How does a community hold on to its soul while opening its heart to change? This question lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the unlikely friendship between an acclaimed actor and a young Amish boy. Bishop Yoder stood on his porch, his stern countenance softened by the events of recent weeks. The sight of David Fisher and his son heading home from seeing Freeman off stirred something in the elderly leader's chest, a recognition that perhaps God's wisdom flowed through many vessels, even those that arrived in automobiles. Anna Zook gathered her teaching materials in the one-room schoolhouse, her fingers trailing over Jacob's latest story. The boy's talent had blossomed under Freeman's guidance, but more importantly, the entire community had learned to see storytelling not as a threat, but as a thread that could strengthen their fabric. She recalled Freeman's words about how stories were like bridges, connecting people across vast differences in belief and background. David Fisher noticed his son's unusual quiet as they rode home. The silence between them had transformed from tense to thoughtful, much like their relationship. Where once he had feared his son's passion for stories would lead him astray, David now understood that Jacob's gift might actually help preserve their way of life. After all, who better to tell the stories of their people than one who loved both the tales and the tradition? The impact of Freeman's visit rippled through the community in unexpected ways. Bishop Yoder, who had initially opposed the actor's presence, found himself incorporating more parables into his Sunday sermons. The children in Anna's classroom shared their own family histories with newfound pride, understanding that their stories carried the weight of generations. Even the most conservative members of the community began to see how storytelling could strengthen, rather than weaken their bonds. Jacob's notebook became a repository of community wisdom. The boy who once feared his gift would separate him from his people now served as a bridge between past and present. His stories captured the essence of Amish life, the simplicity, the devotion, the quiet strength, in ways that honored both tradition and truth. Through his words, the Fisher family's struggles with modern temptations became parables of faithfulness, and their neighbors' barn raising transformed into an epic of community solidarity. Freeman's influence extended beyond mere storytelling technique. He had shown them how narrative could preserve their values while engaging with the wider world. The actor's respect for their ways, combined with his gentle guidance of Jacob's talent, demonstrated how one could remain true to their beliefs while embracing their gifts. What began as a controversial visit had evolved into a lesson about finding God's purpose in unexpected places. Anna Zook observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. Her role as teacher had expanded beyond arithmetic and grammar to include helping her students find their voices. She watched as Jacob's classmates, inspired by his example, began sharing their own tales, stories of faith, family, and tradition that might otherwise have been lost to time. What better way to ensure their way of life endured than by teaching the next generation to articulate its value? The transformation manifested in subtle ways. During community gatherings, older members found themselves sharing memories they had long kept silent. Young people listened with new appreciation to tales of their ancestors' journeys and sacrifices. The act of storytelling itself became a form of worship, a celebration of God's work in their lives across generations. David Fisher discovered that his son's gift offered unexpected blessings. Jacob's stories helped him see their life through fresh eyes, appreciating anew the beauty of their simple ways. The father who once feared storytelling would lead his son astray now recognized it as a tool for strengthening faith and community. But what would the future hold for a young Amish writer whose talent had been nurtured by an unlikely mentor? As the sun set over Lancaster County, Jacob sat at his desk by lamplight, pen moving across paper. Freeman might have departed, but his influence remained in every carefully chosen word, every truthfully rendered scene. The boy who had once written in secret now shared his gift openly, his stories becoming threads in the tapestry of their community's life. What tales would he tell tomorrow, and how would they shape the future of their faith? Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.